Hi there, and welcome to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name is Joshua Bissell, and I'm the editor of this weekly podcast, where we tackle topics around abuse prevention and vulnerable sector protection. This month, we are looking at significant gaps in policies and procedures that we find with organizations that deal with the vulnerable sector. Today, Melodie's getting to some very serious topics around reporting and responding to abuse and allegations of abuse in organizations such as yours. Many of our recommendations, many of the policies and procedures that we advise organizations to take a look at are working towards meeting the highest standard, and they are valuable and important to take under consideration. Today, though, we are talking about a legal requirement in much of North America. And so I want to encourage you to take seriously what Melodie is saying, to take a look at your policies and procedures, to see if there's anything that your organization is doing to impede justice or cover up the truth. Let's work together to protect the vulnerable today. Thank you so much for joining us for Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. Here's Melodie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Josh, for that introduction. Today, we are once again picking up on our series of common gaps found in policy reviews and audits that we conduct at Plan to Protect. We've got the privilege of reviewing many of your policies and identifying opportunities for improvement and updates. And we have identified a number of different gaps that are common in the policies and procedures that we review. Last week, we tackled documentation management. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to that podcast, I really want to encourage you to do that. That is a common gap, and it will put your organization at great risk if you do not have the documentation that you need if you are ever called into court. As I mentioned last week, we did identify a number of different gaps. We considered counting them down, but we really want to help you address these gaps today, not in the future. We want you to go to your policies and your procedures and your homework assignment as a result of listening to this podcast. I want to encourage you to please go check out your policies and see if this is a gap in your policies. So the topic we're going to tackle today is a runner-up. It also came as an area that is a significant gap that we often find, and that deals with reporting and responding to abuse. This gap, especially, if you get this wrong, the consequences for having this incorrect in your policies and procedures could cause significant harm to children, youth, and vulnerable adults. If we don't get reporting and responding to abuse correct, we could cause extensive harm to children, youth, and vulnerable adults. This is one area that we have to get right. So I encourage you to go check out your policies and make sure that your policies and procedures relating to reporting and responding to abuse is correctly stated. Think with me for a moment of Gymnastics USA. Years ago, individuals suspected that Larry Nassar had abused children. People raised red flags. Those red flags were ignored. They did not have the culture of being a courageous organization to respond and report to abuse appropriately. Not only is a child abused, but families are impacted. The reputation of the organization is shattered. Lives are impacted. You end up in court with huge liability costs, and payouts. There's 3 ways that you will learn about abuse within your organization. The first way is through a disclosure. A child, a young person, a vulnerable adult discloses that they have been abused by an individual. It may be around a campfire. It may be in a catechism or Sunday school class. It may be to you as a counselor or a mentor, a good family friend. The second way that you will learn about abuse is through an allegation where someone accuses someone else of abuse. Just this past week, I had a phone call from a parent with an allegation that there was a teacher within the school that had been accused of abuse, and the school was ignoring the accusation and still allowing the teacher to continue to teach. The third way that you may discover that someone is abused is you may see a series of indicators and have a suspicion of abuse. You believe there's reason to believe that a child, a young person, or a vulnerable adult is being abused. As I said, there are common gaps within the policies and procedures that we see. At Plan to Protect, we offer a free assessment. We've had close to 2,000 organizations take our assessment online. The category of responding and reporting abuse often ranks the lowest on the assessment. Let me give you some statistics of 3 of the questions that are found on our assessment. The first question is we complete suspected abuse report forms for all suspected abuse and allegations of abuse. So that's a question on the assessment form. Only 52% of the 2,000 respondents said yes to that question. The second question reads, our volunteers and staff are first required to report the abuse to leadership prior to reporting to law enforcement or child protection agencies. So in the policy, it will say, if you hear an allegation, a disclosure, or have reasonable belief that a child is in need of protection, you must first come and talk to your supervisor or someone else within the organization. 87% of the respondents said either yes or unknown to that question. Now, there's a real concern with that because that opens the opportunity. That opens the door for internal investigations to take place, for someone to talk someone down from reporting it to law enforcement. The third question on the assessment. Our organization investigates all allegations and disclosures and suspicions of abuse prior to reporting to law enforcement or child protection agencies. On this question, 25% of the respondents said true. 35% of the respondents said unsure, they don't know. The duty to report child abuse is the most important law in place for the protection of children and youth. It is a law to report child abuse and neglect. It is a law to report elder abuse within nursing homes. There's a law to report the abuse against individuals with cognitive disabilities. The law is unique to each province, territory, and state. But in North America, In Canada, in the United States, there are very clear laws that state that you must report abuse. As I said, the law is based in the province, the state, or the territory. The law states who is a mandatory reporter of abuse, the timing of when the report should be made. Each act or law clearly identifies definitions of abuse and categories of abuse. So, as I said, this is a gap that we often find in policies and procedures and in training. Organizations will entrust the care of children, youth, and vulnerable adults to volunteers and staff. However, they are mismanaging the reporting and response protocols and processes, and the laws are not reflected in their policies and procedures. We are finding that they are doing their own investigations. They're allowing parents to determine if a report is going to be made or not. Just heard a case study just this past week of child-to-child abuse that happened within an organization. The difference in the age between the two children was close to 4 years different. There was sexual abuse that occurred. The information came to light, but the parents decided that they did not want to report this to their organization. They did not want to report this to law enforcement. One of the parents, the parent of the older child that sexually abused the younger child, was a senior leader within the organization. They knew the policies and procedures that were in place. Too often we are finding written in the policies and the procedures and communicated in the training that prior to any report being made to law enforcement or child protection agencies, you must first report it to senior leadership, and they will determine if a report should be made. We are also finding that they are assessing the reliability or truthfulness of the abuse and not leaving the investigation to law enforcement and child and family services. They're allowing adults that have been accused of abuse to continue to work with the vulnerable sector, similar to the case study I heard earlier this week of the teacher that had been accused of abuse that was still in the classroom. In some organizations and denominations, there is a policy insisting that there be 2 witnesses in place to substantiate the allegation or disclosure of abuse. Another common thing that we have found is that the reporter is being disciplined. They have lost their position. They have been shunned or gaslighted and told that they are not to make the report. And in some cases, they've even lost their job because they raised concerns about an allegation, a disclosure, or a suspicion of abuse. We also find within the policies and procedures, the practices within organizations where they are further harming the victim by laying blame, disbelieving, further gaslighting the victim, using words like, "You are blowing this out of proportion. What's the big deal? You must be misreading the information." Those are all phrases that are commonly used for gaslighting. Another gap that we have found is that the series of questions that are being asked of victims of abuse when there's been an allegation or disclosure of abuse or reasonable belief that someone is in need of protection, they are asking leading questions and interfering in the court case, tainting the court case or impeding justice. As identified in our assessment, they're also not keeping good documentation when there is an incident of abuse. I think of one case study where a parent disclosed to a senior pastor that there was abuse, and they negotiated with the pastor not to report it to law enforcement or to child and family services. The pastor knew of the information. The parents made the pastor promise that that person would never be placed in a position of leadership within the church. The pastor never kept good documentation, never shared the information with the board of elders within the church. And 10 years later, the individual that abused the child, his name came up to be an elder within the church. There was no documented history that the abuse had happened and that it was not responded to or reported appropriately. And finally, the last two gaps that we often find in relation to reporting and responding to abuse. They do not provide the support and the nurturing care that victim survivors of abuse need. Instead, they are saying, I think that's too much information for you to tell. I think it's time for you to move on. Let's not talk about your abuse. The last gap that we often find in relation to reporting and responding to abuse is they're not holding perpetrators accountable for their abuse and exploitation through prosecution, dismissal, and establishing tough parameters on them. We often get the question, but what about forgiveness? They've already served their time. Shouldn't we allow them to come back and work within the organization and demonstrate that we believe in forgiveness? My response is always that the victim survivor has a lifelong journey of healing. As you know, this is a topic of great interest to me. This is what my doctoral thesis is on: the healing of victim survivors of abuse. And if we do not deal with individuals that are abusers, predators, appropriately, it continues to perpetuate the harm to the victim survivor. As I often say, when this question is asked about forgiveness, yes, we can forgive, but there are long-term consequences to the choices that they made. We understand that churches want to welcome in perpetrators and individuals that have been convicted of crimes and abuse. However, the parameters that you put on those individuals using a covenant of care, an offender's covenant, is really the answer to ensuring that there are strong parameters in place so that victims and survivors of abuse can find the nurturing and the healing that they need, because it really is a lifelong journey. There are lifelong consequences to this form of abuse. Now, I understand that many people are hesitant in reporting abuse. What if I'm wrong? I don't have enough evidence. I don't really want to get involved. I don't know who to call. I didn't realize I had a responsibility to report. In Canada, everyone is a mandatory reporter of abuse. I'm going to say that again. In Canada, our provincial acts, our territorial acts, all state that we are all mandatory reporters of abuse. it is very clear that we all have a responsibility individually if we hear an allegation or a disclosure of abuse, or we have reasonable belief that a child is in need of protection, to call law enforcement or child and family services. In the United States, each state, their act, their law, identifies who is a mandatory reporter of abuse. In many cases, it will be doctors, nurses, medical practitioners, educators, clergy that are mandatory reporters of abuse. Some states say that everyone is a mandatory reporter of abuse. Listen to me, though. We are all ethical reporters of abuse. We have an ethical duty to report abuse. This is an epidemic that is worldwide. It is harming our children, our youth, and our vulnerable adults. Be a courageous leader. Pick up the phone. Report abuse to law enforcement or child and family services. International agencies funded by partners and even Global Affairs Canada require that abuse be reported to these funders and also to law enforcement. Your policies, your definitions of abuse, your reporting and response procedures, your training should not impede in the reporting and response to abuse. The investigation should be external by professionals, law enforcement, child protection agencies. Allow them to do the initial investigation. Your policies should include definitions of abuse, the legal duty to report abuse, who is required to make the report. Your policy should clearly state the policy and the procedure for reporting, reflecting the legal duty to report. Don't first require people to report it to you so that you can assess whether the report should be made. You certainly, as an organization, can ask your volunteers and require your volunteers to also notify you when a report is to be made. Your policies and procedures can even encourage individuals that are hesitant to report to reach out to you so that you can help them make the report. But nothing should stand in the way of meeting the legal duty to report, including your policies and procedures, whistleblower policies, so people know a safe person that they can disclose abuse to. In closing, if someone is accusing someone in your organization for abuse, please don't assess the probability of this on your own. Report it to legal authorities. Report it to child protection agencies. If it is found to be inconclusive, bring in a third-party investigator to determine the preponderance of evidence. Is there a 51% chance or higher than that there was inappropriate behavior that took place? Your response to abuse can make all the difference in law enforcement doing their job, in child protection agencies fulfilling their mandate to protect children. For the child, the youth, or the vulnerable adult that's been abused, to get the immediate help they need to stop the abuse from continuing and for the healing to begin. Last week, I had the privilege of participating in the inaugural symposium on Faith and Flourishing, Strategies for Preventing and Healing of Child Sexual Abuse, hosted by Harvard University. I had the privilege of facilitating a number of roundtables. When asked what is the number one initiative that we can make to make a difference within our communities within the next year, the call to have organizational courage came forward and was discussed as the number one priority. We need to call organizations to have courage to deal appropriately with abuse. We need to have organization courage to speak about this within our pulpits, from boardroom tables, in our training classes. We need to encourage individuals to have courage to talk about abuse. We need that boldness to keep the conversation going. At Plan to Protect, we are so ready to help you. Our network of members provides a tremendous opportunity to collect best practices, case studies, have those bold conversations about abuse. As a member, you can call us and email us at any time. We'd be happy to talk through the issues that come up within your organization, to sit with you around your table, to have this conversation, to know how to appropriately report and respond to abuse. I encourage you to avail yourselves of our resources, our policy gap analysis, our policy templates, our training, our consultant work. We are here to help you fill this gap, and instead of it being a weakness, for you to be a leader and for this to be a strength within your organizations. Have a great week, everyone. Don't forget, go check out your policies and look to see if this is a gap in your policies. Take care. Bye.